No one in the courtroom expected his final request. The judge had heard countless appeals before, but this one was different. A man, moments away from a life-changing verdict, didn't ask for mercy. He didn't ask for another chance. All he wanted was to see his dog. What happened next left everyone speechless. This is a story of loyalty, love, and an unexpected twist that shook the entire courtroom. A man, accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit, sat before the judge, waiting for his fate. But before the final decision, he made a plea, one that no one could have predicted. And when his request was granted, something happened that changed everything. Make sure you watch till the end, because this story will stay with you long after it's over. John Carter sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. He had seen battlefields, he had faced enemies, but nothing felt as terrifying as the four walls of this courtroom closing in on him. He wasn't supposed to be here, not like this. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, heavier than the bulletproof vest he used to wear in combat. The people sitting in the rows behind him, strangers, jurors, and even the prosecutors, didn't see the man he truly was. They only saw what the evidence suggested: a criminal, a thief, a man who had taken something that didn't belong to him. But he wasn't guilty. He knew that. And yet, the truth didn't seem to matter. John Carter wasn't a perfect man, but he had tried to be a good one. He had given his youth to the military, signing up at a young age with nothing but a deep desire to serve his country. The uniform became his identity, and the battlefield became his reality. But war doesn't just take lives. Sometimes, it takes something far worse. It takes pieces of you. John came back different. He came back to a home that no longer felt like home. The nightmares followed him, creeping into his mind when he least expected them. He couldn't sleep, and when he did, he wished he hadn't. His wife, Sarah, tried to hold on at first. She whispered reassurances in the dark, held his trembling hands, told him it would get better. But it didn't, and one day she left. John didn't blame her. She took their daughter with her, and just like that, his family was gone. Then came the job losses, the eviction notices, the slow but painful unraveling of everything he had built, until all that remained was him and Max. Max wasn't just a dog. John had rescued him from an abusive owner years ago. The scrawny German Shepherd mix had been chained to a post, ribs showing through his skin, his eyes dull and lifeless. John didn't need another responsibility at the time, but something about the way Max looked at him, like he had already accepted that the world had given up on him, made John take him home. And from that day on, Max became more than just a pet. He became family. Max was there when John had nothing. When the nightmares got worse, Max would nuzzle against his chest, as if pushing the terror away. When the loneliness became unbearable, Max would wag his tail, bringing a sense of warmth that John hadn't felt in years. Max didn't care that John was a broken man. He loved him anyway. It was supposed to be a normal evening. John had walked to the store, just a few blocks from his small apartment. Max had wanted to come along, but John told him to stay. "I won't be long, buddy." Famous last words. The moment he stepped outside, the crisp night air felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was off. He ignored the feeling. Just paranoia, he told himself. But as he rounded the corner, he heard it, shouting, glass shattering, and then sirens. A few blocks away, the convenience store was in chaos. A man in a ski mask had just bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness. John barely had time to register what was happening before the police arrived. And then guns drawn, on the ground, hand where we can see them. Confused, John raised his hands, heart pounding. He didn't run, he didn't resist, but none of it mattered. He matched the description. Late 30s, tall, dark jacket, wrong place, wrong time. The next thing he knew, he was being shoved into the back of a police car. And Max was left alone, waiting by the door, never knowing why his owner never came home that night. The trial was quick, too quick. John had no solid alibi. He was alone that night, as he was most nights. The store clerk pointed him out in a lineup, convinced he was the man behind the mask. The real thief had vanished without a trace. But John was an easy target, a former soldier, struggling with PTSD. No stable job, no family to vouch for him. A man like that, society had already decided his fate long before the judge did. His court-appointed lawyer tried his best, but against the evidence, his words were just background noise. And so, John Carter, once a decorated soldier, became case number 26793. A convicted man, a man who would soon be sentenced. And that's when he made his request. The judge had seen many men break down before sentencing. Some begged for their families. Others pleaded for another chance. But John Carter, he just had one request. "Let me see my dog," he said, his voice hoarse. The courtroom was silent. The judge blinked, confused. Even his own lawyer turned to look at him, surprised. The request wasn't normal. It wasn't what anyone expected. Most men in John's position would be fighting for their freedom, their future. But John knew the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't asking for mercy. He wasn't asking for another chance. He just wanted to say goodbye to Max, because once he was locked away, he knew he'd never see him again. The judge looked at John for a long time. Then he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Carter, this is highly unusual." John's heart sank. But then, the judge leaned forward. "Bring in the dog," he said. Gasps echoed through the room. Even John's lawyer looked stunned. A guard rushed out to make arrangements. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy, with something unspoken. Something was about to happen, something no one expected, because the moment Max entered that courtroom, everything changed. The judge hesitated. It wasn't a typical request. Most men in John's position begged for mercy, for another chance. They pleaded for their families, their freedom, their future. But John Carter, all he wanted was to see his dog. At first, there were whispers in the courtroom. Some exchanged confused glances, unsure whether this was some kind of joke. A criminal, moments away from a sentencing that would define the rest of his life. And this was what he was asking for. The prosecutor frowned, shuffling through papers, as if looking for some hidden reason behind the request. But John wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't playing a game. He just wanted Max. The judge exhaled, glancing at John's lawyer. "Mr. Dawson," he said, rubbing his temples, "your client's request is highly unusual." John's lawyer, Matthew Dawson, stood up slowly. His eyes flickered toward John before he turned to face the judge. "Your Honor." Dawson hesitated. He knew this was a long shot. The legal system wasn't designed for sentimentality, but still he had to try. "Max isn't just a pet," Dawson said, his voice steady. "He's the reason John is still alive today." That one sentence changed the entire mood in the room. The whispers stopped. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The judge, who had already been on the verge of shutting down the request, suddenly seemed curious. Dawson adjusted his tie, taking a deep breath before continuing. "John Carter served in the military for years," he said, his voice ringing clear. "He gave everything to his country, and when he came back, the world wasn't the same. A few people shifted in their seats. This courtroom sees a lot of men like John," Dawson continued. "Men who come back home from war only to realize they don't have a home anymore. Men who suffer in silence because the world expects them to just move on, as if they didn't leave pieces of themselves on the battlefield." The judge's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped lightly on the wooden desk in front of him. Dawson pressed forward. "John had no one when he came back. His wife left. He lost his job. The nightmares never let him sleep. And when he felt like giving up, when he felt like ending it all, Max was the only reason he didn't." A few gasps could be heard in the room. John's hands tightened into fists on the table. He didn't like talking about this. He didn't want people to look at him like some broken man. But right now, his pride didn't matter. Max was the only thing that mattered. Dawson turned to the judge. "John didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't beg for sympathy. He isn't even asking for his freedom. He just wants to see his best friend one last time before he's taken away." The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. His fingers interlocked as he studied John. Then Dawson. "This is a court of law, not a reunion center." The prosecutor finally spoke up, his tone sharp. "We can't set a precedent where every convicted man gets to have personal requests." John's chest tightened. He could feel the moment slipping away. The judge nodded slightly. "That's a fair point," he admitted. "But this case isn't exactly typical, is it?" The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, but the judge raised a hand. "I need a moment to think," he said. The room went silent. For what felt like an eternity, the judge stared down at his desk, deep in thought. John wasn't breathing, and then the judge sighed. "Bring the dog in." The words didn't seem real at first. John barely processed them. A guard nodded and quickly exited the room. There was movement in the background, someone making a phone call, people whispering, and then they waited. Every second felt like an hour. John stared at the doors, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. What if Max wasn't okay? What if he didn't recognize him? What if he wasn't even there anymore? The prosecutor sighed, clearly annoyed. "This is a waste of time," he muttered under his breath. But John didn't care. He just needed to see Max. Minutes passed. Then, a faint sound, the jingle of a collar, soft footsteps on the polished courtroom floor. And then, before John could even blink, the doors burst open, and there he was, Max. He wasn't the same dog John had left behind. His fur looked a little duller, and he had lost weight. But those eyes, those deep, knowing, soulful eyes, they were the same. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Then, Max. John barely had time to react before 85 pounds of pure loyalty crashed into him. Max leaped onto his owner, knocking over the chair as John fell back, gasping. The German Shepherd's tail was wagging so hard it was a blur, his whines filled with so much emotion that it was impossible to ignore. Tears stung John's eyes as he wrapped his arms around his dog. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm right here." Max buried his face against John's chest, licking his neck, his face, his hands, anywhere he could reach. His body trembled with overwhelming joy, as if afraid that if he let go, John would disappear again. And John, for the first time in a long, long time, he felt whole again. The entire courtroom was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the prosecutor, who had been so determined to make this request seem ridiculous, had lost the words he was about to say. A woman in the back sniffled, dabbing at her eyes. One of the jurors, an older man who had been mostly stone-faced throughout the trial, cleared his throat, looking away as if he didn't want anyone to see the moisture in his eyes. Because this wasn't just a dog and his owner. This was something more. This was love in its purest form. And no one, not even the toughest, most hardened individuals in that courtroom, could deny what they were seeing. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a homecoming. John had gotten what he wanted. He had seen Max. He had held him, felt his warmth, heard his familiar breath. It should have ended there. But then, the judge leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice unusually soft. John turned, still kneeling on the floor with Max beside him. The judge glanced around the room, at the faces filled with emotion, before his gaze landed back on John. He exhaled. "Maybe we got this wrong." John's breath caught. The entire courtroom shifted, the weight of those words sinking in, and in that moment, everything changed. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. John Carter had spent months, no, years, waiting for this moment. And now, it was finally happening. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and there he was, Max. John's breath caught in his throat. For a second, time seemed to freeze. Max wasn't just a dog to him. He was everything. The one constant in a life that had been nothing but war, loss, and betrayal. The moment John saw him, something deep inside him broke. His composure, his control, everything he had bottled up, the pain, the loneliness, the hopelessness, came flooding out all at once. Tears burned in his eyes as Max sprinted toward him. The officer holding the leash barely had time to react before the German Shepherd yanked free, dragging him forward with sheer, uncontainable force. And then, Max leaped into John's arms. The impact nearly knocked the chair over. John barely caught himself as Max buried his face against his chest, whimpering, licking his face, trembling with emotion. John let out a broken laugh, wrapping his arms around his best friend, his fingers gripping Max's, for like he was afraid to let go. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm right here." Max's tail wagged so hard it was a blur, his breath hot against John's skin. The dog didn't care about the courtroom, the people watching, or the fact that this was all happening in the middle of a trial. All he cared about was that John was here, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. But then, something changed. A sharp bark rang out, then another. At first, John thought it was just excitement, but then, Max's body stiffened. His ears perked up, his tail stopped wagging, his entire posture changed. And then, he did something that no one expected. Max spun around, his hackles rising. A deep, rumbling growl escaped his throat as he locked eyes with a man sitting in the gallery. A well-dressed man, a man who had been watching the trial with mild interest, a man John recognized instantly. Wait, John's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Max had never met this man before, so why was he growling? Why was he acting like he had just come face to face with the enemy? People in the courtroom exchanged confused glances. The judge leaned forward, his gaze flicking between Max and the man in question. Even the prosecutor, who had been so determined to see John convicted, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had turned solid. And then, Max barked again, louder, sharper. John Carter had spent months, no, years, waiting for this moment. And now, it was finally happening. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and there he was, Max. John's breath caught in his throat. For a second, time seemed to freeze. Max wasn't just a dog to him. He was everything. The one constant in a life that had been nothing but war, loss, and betrayal. The moment John saw him, something deep inside him broke. His composure, his control, everything he had bottled up, the pain, the loneliness, the hopelessness, came flooding out all at once. Tears burned in his eyes as Max sprinted toward him. The officer holding the leash barely had time to react before the German Shepherd yanked free, dragging him forward with sheer, uncontainable force. And then, Max leaped into John's arms. The impact nearly knocked the chair over. John barely caught himself as Max buried his face against his chest, whimpering, licking his face, trembling with emotion. John let out a broken laugh, wrapping his arms around his best friend, his fingers gripping Max's, for like he was afraid to let go. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm right here." Max's tail wagged so hard it was a blur, his breath hot against John's skin. The dog didn't care about the courtroom, the people watching, or the fact that this was all happening in the middle of a trial. All he cared about was that John was here, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. But then, something changed. A sharp bark rang out, then another. At first, John thought it was just excitement, but then Max's body stiffened. His ears perked up, his tail stopped wagging, his entire posture changed. And then, he did something that no one expected. Max spun around, his hackles rising. A deep, rumbling growl escaped his throat as he locked eyes with a man sitting in the gallery. A well-dressed man, a man who had been watching the trial with mild interest. A man John recognized instantly. Wait, John's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Max had never met this man before. So why was he growling? Why was he acting like he had just come face to face with the enemy? People in the courtroom exchanged confused glances. The judge leaned forward, his gaze flicking between Max and the man in question. Even the prosecutor, who had been so determined to see John convicted, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had turned solid. And then, Max barked again, louder, sharper. This wasn't just excitement. This was something else, something urgent. John froze. Max had been trained to recognize threats. He had spent years by John's side, sensing danger before it even arrived. And right now, he was locked onto that man like his life depended on it. John's pulse roared in his ears, because he knew what this meant. Max wasn't just barking at random. He was warning them. Something was wrong. And then, the man in the gallery tensed. The moment Max let out a low, guttural growl, the man's face changed. At first, it was just a flicker, a flash of unease, before he quickly tried to mask it. But it was too late. John saw it. The judge saw it. The entire courtroom saw it. The man shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Call your dog off," he said, his voice unnaturally tense. John didn't move. Neither did Max. The German Shepherd stood his ground, his teeth barely visible as he let out another deep, warning growl. John's chest tightened. Max had never reacted like this before, not unless he sensed something truly wrong. And that's when John put it together. The man Max was barking at, he was one of the key witnesses who had testified against John. A witness who had claimed he saw John at the scene of the crime. A witness whose testimony had been the final nail in the coffin. And yet, Max had never met him before. So how did he know? John swallowed hard, and then he spoke. "Max only reacts like this when he senses danger," he said, his voice low. The room tensed. The judge narrowed his eyes. The prosecution team looked visibly unsettled. The witness shifted again, his hands clenched. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. And then, he snapped. I made a mistake," he blurted out. The room erupted. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. John's breath hitched. The judge's eyes widened. Even the prosecutor went pale. The man hesitated for only a second before the dam broke. "John wasn't there," he stammered. I was pressured to say he was. I lied." Complete silence. The kind of silence that suffocates. Then, chaos. The judge pounded his gavel, calling for order. The courtroom exploded into frantic whispers. The prosecution team looked like they had just been hit by a truck. And John, he sat there stunned. His dog, his best friend, had just exposed the truth. Max had saved him. The weight of the moment settled over the room. The witness had confessed. John wasn't guilty. He had spent months behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. And the only reason the truth had come out was because of a dog who refused to let a liar walk free. The judge turned slowly, looking at the prosecution. The prosecutor cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, I believe we need to reevaluate this case." John's heart pounded. The judge's eyes flicked back to him, then to Max. And then, he nodded. And just like that, everything changed. For a long moment, The courtroom remained silent. The confession still hung in the air. John Carter sat in stunned disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. For months, he had lived under the weight of an accusation that had stolen everything from him: his freedom, his dignity, his hope. And yet, in the end, the truth hadn't come from his own words. It had come from Max, his best friend, his savior. The judge turned to the prosecution team, his expression unreadable. "Given this development," he said, his voice measured, "I think it's clear that Mr. Carter's case needs to be re-examined immediately." The lead prosecutor swallowed hard. For the first time in this entire trial, he looked uncertain. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "I believe we need to reconsider the validity of this case." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. John's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, my client has spent months behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. He has suffered enough." The judge's expression remained stern, but there was something in his eyes, a recognition of the injustice that had played out right in front of him. He exhaled deeply. Then he nodded. "The court is adjourned. I am ordering an immediate review of Mr. Carter's case." John's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. What followed was a whirlwind. The case that had taken months to build against John fell apart within hours. Once the witness cracked, investigators went back and dug deeper, and that's when they found it: the surveillance footage that had mysteriously gone missing during the initial investigation was uncovered, and it proved what John had been saying all along. He hadn't been anywhere near the crime scene. The real criminals had been caught on tape, their faces visible, and John, he was miles away, buying dog food from Max at the time of the robbery. The very thing that had cost him his freedom, his lack of an alibi, turned out to be the very thing that saved him, because the security camera from the pet store had a timestamp, and it cleared him completely. It happened so fast that John could barely believe it. 1 minute, he was sitting in a jail cell, staring at the cold concrete walls that had become his world. The next, the guards were unlocking the door. "You're free to go," one of them said, his voice lacking the usual cold detachment. John just stared. For a long time, he had convinced himself that this moment would never come, that no matter how much he fought, no matter how loudly he proclaimed his innocence, no one would listen. But they had. Because of Max, he stepped out of the holding area, and the first thing he saw was his lawyer waiting for him, and standing right beside him, Max. The second their eyes met, Max let out an excited bark and lunged forward, dragging the leash with him. John dropped to his knees, just as Max reached him, and the dog practically knocked him over, his tail wagging furiously as he licked John's face over and over again. John laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't felt in a long, long time. And then, he broke down. Tears burned his eyes as he hugged Max tight, burying his face in the thick fur of the only soul who had never abandoned him. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're such a good boy, Max." Max whimpered in response, pressing closer, as if he understood everything. Maybe he did. Maybe he always had. Walking out of that courthouse should have felt like victory, but to John, it felt surreal. The world outside seemed brighter somehow, like everything had more color, more life. The air smelled different. The sky looked different. For months, he had dreamed of this moment, and yet, as he stepped outside, Max by his side, it hit him. There was no one waiting for him, no family, no home to return to. Prison had taken months from him, but the truth was life had been taken from him long before that. His past was a mess of scars, mistakes, and regret. But standing here now, with Max beside him, he realized something. He wasn't alone, because Max had been there before the trial, before the accusations, before everything fell apart. And today, Max hadn't just been his best friend. He had been the reason John got his life back. Not because he could speak, not because he could argue in court, but because he had simply known the truth and refused to let the world ignore it. John swallowed hard and looked down at his best friend. "You ready to go home, buddy?" Max tilted his head, then wagged his tail. John let out a small laugh. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." John didn't have much when he walked away from that courthouse. Just the clothes on his back and a dog who had saved his life. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man with nothing. He felt like a man who had been given another chance. There were still things to figure out, where he would go, what he would do now that he was free. But as he looked at Max, the one soul who had never abandoned him, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Some people go through life believing they can only count on themselves. John Carter had believed that once, too. But in the end, it wasn't his own strength that saved him. It was the loyalty of a friend who never left his side. A friend who didn't care about past mistakes, or what the world thought, or whether the odds were stacked against them. A friend who, in a room full of liars, had recognized the truth, and that friend had 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a heart big enough to change the course of a man's life. Because in the end, Max hadn't just been John's companion, he had been his savior. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more incredible animal stories.